Now, today's shiur is, yesterday we talked about gebrocks, and I mentioned that you could eat gebrocks on the last day of Pesach, right? In the Chabad tradition. Well, today I'm also going to fast forward to the last day of Pesach, because usually we wind up spending a lot of time learning about Pesach itself, but we forget about the end of Pesach. So today's shiur is lessons from Caesar. Why am I going in to talk about Caesar? What Caesar got to do with any of us here? So since we talked plenty about Pesach over the last couple of days, and we are, please God, this Saturday night going to enjoy good quality family time at our Seder with our loved ones, with whomever we're celebrating the Seder with this year. You should know, by the way, those who wind up doing Zoom. Last year, many Jews wound up on Zoom for the Seder. It dawned on me that the original Seder actually was also done in Zoom. You know why? Because it says in the Torah, the Jews left b'chipazon. They left in a hurry. It means they zoomed out of Egypt, okay? So because they zoomed out of Egypt, well, we also we're on Zoom right now together, right? Zoom and Facebook and YouTube. So a very warm welcome to everyone who's with us here. And very, very exciting that we're just 2 days away from Pesach. Maybe we'll have a shiur tomorrow, maybe not. Let's see what happens. But today we're going to zoom to the end of Pesach. And let's talk about the significance of the end of Pesach. Because Pesach itself, we discussed plenty about it. And there are many elements of Pesach that are widely known. And then there are some aspects that are not as, let's say, popular or prominently experienced or known. And the end of Pesach, for some reason, tends to be one of those orphans that aren't as well experienced. And that's why I thought, let's move on today. Because the first part of Pesach, obviously, is probably firstly one of the most famous stories of all time. And it is probably one of the most widely celebrated parts of Pesach. But then comes Chol HaMoed, right? We have a little bit of a break. And in fact, from a Torah perspective, it's still a holy time, although we can conduct work. But the end of Pesach, there's Shvi Shel Pesach. For those joining us from Israel, it's just one day. That's your Shvi'i, your seventh day of Pesach, which is also Achor on the last day of Pesach. But for those of us here in the diaspora, in South Africa or anywhere else, you may be joining us. I see we have someone from Australia on here as well, on our Facebook group. So welcome, Esther. And in the diaspora, wherever you might be, anywhere outside of Israel, on next Sunday, not this coming, the following Sunday, that's the last day of Pesach. It's still a holiday, it's still a festival. It's a rabbinic enactment to have this extra day for those who are outside of Israel. I gave a shiur about that a while ago, why that is that outside of Israel, we have an additional day of the holiday because we weren't sure which day was declared as Rosh Chodesh. For those who lived outside of Israel, don't forget Rosh Chodesh is not like a calendar that we have today. But once upon a time, the calendar was something that was determined by seeing the new moon. So you saw the new moon, it was declared Rosh Chodesh in Israel. There was no WhatsApp, there was no TV, there was no broadcast. Had it somebody living in Spain or India or Babylon, wherever Jews were distant from Israel, now probably Babylon, you could say it's close to Israel, wasn't such a big deal. But there were Jews in Spain, and there were Jews in India, and there were Jews in other countries. So how did they know when it was going to be, when the first day or second day of Yom Tov was going to be? There was a accepted custom that they always added one extra day of the holiday. And since the destruction of the temple, with Jews being dispersed all over the world, the sages decided, let's do this actually for every holiday to distinguish between Israel and diaspora. So this is the rabbinic day, the additional day, but it is a very special day. In Israel, it will be on Shabbos, outside of Israel on Sunday. And in fact, the Baal Shem Tov really cherished this day. It's a day that we celebrate in many ways. It's a day that has a special extra significance that I want to discuss with you. And wherever you'll be, make sure you celebrate this day in its own special way, because it is the day of the light of Mashiach shining brightly. In fact, I would like to read to you something very, very short from the writings of the previous Rebbe. He says that the last day of Pesach is the conclusion of what began on the first night of Pesach. First night of Pesach, we celebrate our emancipation from slavery from Egypt, right? The last day of Pesach, though, is a little bit different. What are we celebrating on the last day of Pesach, ladies and gents? What's the last day of Pesach? Well, we know that Shvi Shel Pesach is when the sea split, which we're going to celebrate. But the last day of Pesach, we're going to read the book of Isaiah. We're going to read the prophecy of Isaiah, in which he describes the future redemption. So we have the past redemption, which is the beginning of Pesach. When we were emancipated, we were freed from our slavery in Egypt. And the last day of Pesach is when we celebrate the future redemption with the coming of Mashiach. So this is something that is going to be emphasized in the Haftarah reading that we read on that day of Pesach. We know that the Haftarah, we read the Chumash, the Torah reading in the morning service, and that's followed by the Haftarah reading. And the Haftarah reading, if you open your Chumash, you'll see it comes from the book of Isaiah. I, in fact, would like to do that for you right now. I'm going to open my Chumash. Any Chumash you open, you will see the prophecy of Isaiah. Let's read through part of it together and get a little bit of an understanding what it's about, okay? Says, this is, or if you have just a general book of Isaiah, you could find it in chapter 10. Let's read a couple of verses together. I'm going to go with chapter 10, verse 32. Od hayom benov lamed. Still today, he intends to stand in Nob. He waves his hand towards the mount of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. Okay, fast forward, read through here. It's a beautiful description of what is going to happen in the future redemption. And let's read a few powerful words, because this is a description of what's going to be, according to the Jewish prophet Isaiah. And he says here, he shall judge the poor justly. He shall chastise with equity the humble of the earth. He shall smite the earth with the root of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall put the wicked to death. It will be a day of great judgment. And then he continues, and the righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faith the girdle of his loins. Here is the prophecy you will see if you go to Kruger Park when Mashiach comes. And the wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie with the kid, and a calf and a lion cub and a fatling shall lie together. And a small child shall lead them. Imagine that. Go to Kruger Park on Pesach, perhaps when Mashiach comes, and you'll experience and witness this firsthand, as the prophet Isaiah tells us. And a cow and a bear shall graze together. Their children shall lie, and a lion like cattle shall eat straw. And an infant shall play over the hole of an old snake, and over the eyeball of an adder. And a weaned child shall stretch forth his hand. They shall neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mount. For all the land shall be filled with the knowledge of God. Kamayim layam mechasim, like the water covers over the sea. Those are some of the words of the prophet Isaiah describing the future redemption. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a description of what's going to be. So why is this beautiful, majestic description read on the last day of Pesach? You ever wondered what's its significance? Right? There's various explanations. Let me share with you the conventional explanation given why we read this on the last day of Pesach is because of the downfall of Sancheriv. Now, I'm sure if you know a little bit of Jewish history, you know the story of Sancheriv. He was the king of Ashur, Assyria. You might know a very famous song. It's actually from the words of the prophet. Describing the ingathering of the exiles, describing what Sancheriv did, because Sancheriv is the one who gathered up the axes of forces, you could say, of his time, and he took troops from all the surrounding nations, combined them into one massive army to conquer Jerusalem and the Jewish people, which ultimately was destroyed at that time. The temple was destroyed at the time by, help me out, my memory goes, by Nebuchadnezzar. Sancheriv was the general, Nebuchadnezzar was the king who led the destruction of the temple. And after they arrived in Jerusalem and they laid siege to the entire city, Sancheriv, and you can imagine his enormous legion, they camped around the walled city of Jerusalem now this was later, the destruction came from oh my gosh, from not Herod. Herod is the second temple. From not Sancheriv, Nebuchadnezzar. But what happened with Sancheriv was that they camped around Jerusalem, and they were planning to attack, to destroy the city. The stage was set for this terrible massacre. But what happened? Nothing came to fruition as he had planned. In the middle of the night, a miracle happened. God sent an angel who killed almost the whole army, maybe the whole entire army. And the next morning, Sancheriv was forced to flee for his life. So this is obviously an incredible miracle. And this is in the time of King Chizkiah. And why was that? Because Chizkiah expressed his trust, his faith in God. And he actually slept that whole night with faith that God would help the Jewish nation to be victorious over their enemy. And of course, despite all odds, they were victorious, and miraculously they survived. So that's one explanation of why we read this on this day of the last day of Pesach, because according to the Talmud, this occurred on Pesach. Okay, that's one perspective. It sounds very nice. The thing is, it didn't occur on the last day of Pesach. When did it happen? On the first day of Pesach. So why would we choose to read about it on the last day? You might say because it's overshadowed by the miracles of the Exodus, perhaps. But another question that comes to mind is that the story of Sancheriv's downfall is only a very small fraction of this entire Haftarah. So although the Talmud mentions this idea, why are we mentioning the whole futuristic aspect, right? There has to be a special, unique relationship between this day and Mashiach. And that's what the Baal Shem Tov felt, that in fact, the last day of Pesach, because we read this Haftarah, it emphasizes that it highlights the future redemption. And that's why the Baal Shem Tov instituted a custom that we have a special meal on the last day of Pesach. Like I said, some people, the Vilna Gaon, in fact, called this meal a farewell to Pesach, but the Baal Shem Tov called it the meal of Mashiach, Su'udas Mashiach, the festive meal of Mashiach, Mashiach Su'udah, as we call it in the, in current colloquial parlance. And so this is the day that the energy, the light of Mashiach and the future redemption shines and is most revealed, as the Baal Shem Tov instituted, as the Baal Shem Tov taught us. And that's why we have this very special meal of Mashiach on this day. Now, of course, and if you look at my calendar that I placed here for you, is that the previous day, the seventh day, we celebrate the splitting Kriyas Yamsuf, right? That's what the seventh day of Pesach celebrates. Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, which occurred on the seventh day, 7 days after the Exodus, when there was the emancipation, when the sea split, right? 7 days later, Pharaoh said, what? We let the Jews go? What happened to our whole workforce? All our whole labor force is gone. So they pursued them. And the Haftorah we're going to read on that day, on the seventh day of Pesach, in fact, is related to, the Torah reading is the story of the splitting of the sea. But then what's the connection? In Israel, they're going to read this. What's the connection to the future redemption? Shouldn't we be reading something more related to the splitting of the sea? Right? And that brings us to a bigger question that comes to mind. Why did the Jews have to pass through the sea of reeds altogether? I should have put a map here. But we had at our Pesach retreat a few years ago, a lady, maybe some of you know her, Margaret Rowitz, and she lives here in Joburg. She decided to do the walk, to walk the Exodus route, she called it. I think a few people have done this, to experience that walk that our ancestors did from Egypt to Israel. And there's a much more direct way. You actually don't have to go through the Sea of Reeds. You could have gone directly through the desert without crossing any water, right? The Sea of Reeds is totally out of the way. So we know that God led them on a detour, trapping them between the sea and the chasing Egyptians. And God split the sea, a miracle. But why? And the truth is, if you think about this, the question becomes even stronger when we learn about the whole nature of the crossing of the sea, what it was all about. Did anybody go on Sunday? I took my kids. It was really incredible. To the Chev. The Chev put together this most wonderful display of the splitting of the sea. It was really, really wonderful to experience it. I thought it was very well put together. Years ago, reminds me, I went to Universal Studios in California, and they also put it together in a very cool way. I think the Chev did a better job. You think about, Hollywood loves depicting this epic scene of the Jews trapped between this vast sea and the Egyptian army that's coming through them in the heat of the desert, right? And God miraculously splits the waters. It sounds wonderful and looks amazing. The problem with this scene is that according to tradition, we actually didn't even emerge on the other side. When I drove my kids in the car we went through one side, it came out to the other. That's all a wonderful display put together by the Chev and the wonderful team there. But actually, according to the Talmud, the way the Talmud gives us the narrative of the Torah story, fills in the details, actually, the Jews came out exactly the same side that they entered from. That's what the Talmud describes, that they came out from the side that they entered. So the whole drama of the splitting of the sea doesn't even make sense. If the Jews didn't need to go through the water to get through to Israel, to get through to the promised land, why did God orchestrate this whole fantastic miracle and lead them through right back to where they came from? Good question. So the Ibn Ezra, very famous commentator on the Torah, among many other commentaries, asks this question. And he says that the only reason why God commanded them to go into the water was so that the Egyptians would be submerged in the water. So that this would sort of be a retribution, a retaliation for all that the Egyptians put us through. Okay, so that's the Ibn Ezra's explanation of this, that the Jews didn't need to cross the sea, but it was just for the purpose of God's exacting retribution on the Egyptians. Now, of course, that's a very nice explanation why the whole splitting of the sea was necessary, that God performed all these wonders and miracles for our ancestors to see that God is with them, and they're going to experience this wonderful, fantastic, miraculous emancipation, and they will never have to see these Egyptians pursuing them again. But what's the connection between the splitting of the sea that we commemorate on this day and the celebration of the future redemption of Mashiach? So let's try to first understand who exactly is Mashiach. Okay, there's a strange statement in the Talmud about Mashiach. When the Talmud wants to describe Mashiach, the person who will redeem the entire world from coronavirus, from the bloodshed. Yesterday, another terrible shooting in the US. I don't know what's going on in my home country. Crazy stuff. From all the oppression, all the problems, all the greed and corruption that this world sees. You know how the Talmud describes Mashiach? Describes him as, anyone want to guess? Have you read a little bit of Talmud? This is just, sorry, I wanted to put this on earlier. Talmud describes Mashiach as Caesar. Yep, as a Caesar. And yet the Gemara says, David HaMelech, King David, is Palki Caesar, which means half a Caesar. What on earth is going on? What does this mean? Why will there be a need for a Caesar, Mashiach, and King David is the half Caesar? Why will Mashiach be the Caesar and King David is half Caesar? Don't run away. You have to understand this. You think about this term, the title Caesar. Where does it come from? Where does the title Caesar come from? It actually originates in Latin. It was the family that served as the powerful dictators of the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar, who lived 3 decades before the temple's destruction, he, I think, was the very first Caesar. And he played a critical role in the transformation of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. Caesar's conquest of France, Britain, Germany, eventually Israel, many other countries, and his assassination of what was his name? Escaped from Pompeii, Roman Pompeii, right?
Brutus. Brutus.
What's that?
Brutus.
Brutus. Okay,
Yes.
I thought it was Pompey.
Brutus et tu, Brute.
Okay, good to get some historians on here who know a little bit of what's going on. Thank you for that. So the point I'm making is that Caesar was certainly not the most refined of personalities. You know, it began as a family name, Julius Caesar, right? But then it became an imperial title used by all the Roman and Byzantine empires. They all became Caesars. In fact, the name stuck. It wasn't just the Roman Caesars. I believe that later on, that term was used by many others as well. You think of the term Tsar, it comes from Caesar, right? Tsar of Russia. Or in Austria, they had the Caesar, all the same term. So when the Talmud wants to describe Mashiach and King David, it's using the term Caesar, that was possibly like royalty at that time, and a half Caesar. But the question is why? Why is King David half a Caesar? Besides the point, throughout, most of the terminology used in the Torah to describe royalty is not Caesar, but Melech. Melech is a king, not Caesar, right? The viceroy is called Mishneh LaMelech, the second to the king. Why, when it comes to Mashiach, the greatest future king of Israel, does the Talmud suddenly use a Latin term, Caesar? And besides the point, Caesar is not, like I said, not the most noble term. They are responsible for the destruction of the temple, for so much bloodshed of the Jewish people. And not just the Caesar, but all those other Caesars of history. How many Caesars and Tsars caused us untold misery, persecution of Jews? Why would the Talmud use such a, I don't want to say derogatory, but such a, the name is certainly associated with bloodshed, with negativity. Why would the Talmud use that term to describe Mashiach, the future Redeemer, who's going to bring peace to the world? And why is King David, what's he got to do with this? King David lived, 800 years before Caesar? So why is he defined as the half Caesar? So true, the Jews did actually take a very special liking to the Caesar, to Julius Caesar. And in fact, many Jews earnestly mourned when Caesar was murdered. But this terminology for Caesar, it's interesting that the Jews liked him that much. I think he was promising good for Israel at the time. We did once teach a course about, I did once teach a course about that history at the time, and I don't recall all of it in my mind, but there was some liking about Caesar until they turned against us. The Romans ultimately destroyed the temple. The Talmud says, and I think it's, who was the famous historian at the time, Josephus, and others described the mourning, the tears that were shed by many Jews when Julius Caesar died. Why were so many Jews grief-stricken when Julius was killed, when Caesar was killed, Julius Caesar? They say the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You've heard that term? That definitely applied here, because the Kohen Gadol of the time was a descendant of the Chashmonaim by the name of Hyrcanus. Okay? He had somewhat of an alliance. He had some kind of a connection with Pompey. And the great, at the time, Pompey was considered certainly the great personality, great Roman general. And they marched into Israel. Yet Hyrcanus later allied himself against Pompey. Hyrcanus' change of heart could have been because Pompey at the time actually taxed us heavily and did all, caused us trouble. It's ironic of that time. In fact, if I could just recall back a little bit of what I know, there were two Jewish brothers. One was Aristobulus and the other was Hyrcanus. And they were actually brothers. They were the daughters of, got to refresh my memory. I'm not remembering who their mother was. Very famous Jewish queen. But they were fighting over the throne of succeeding their mother. In fact, there's a street in Jerusalem named for her, but it's skipping my head. If any of you recall, please fill me in. Anyways, they were fighting over succession over Israel, and they went and then brought the Romans into Israel. Very, 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 very sad point in our Jewish history. Okay, I'm not gonna, I don't remember the details, so I can't go too deep into it. But the point is that the Kohen Gadol at the time, Hyrcanus, became allied with Julius Caesar, although he was previously allied with Pompey. And the Jews, basically Caesar brought some kind of relief to the Jewish community. And that's why they mourned when he was murdered. Okay, that's the short of it, without me recalling too much of what that time. But let me share with you an explanation that was presented by the Rebbe in 770 in 1988 at the Seudas Mashiach, and that certainly is a very powerful insight that perhaps could give us another understanding of the significance, of the importance of this day to us. He explained that Talmud tells us the origin of the name Caesar. Where did the name Caesar come from? Okay? Now think in modern day history. In fact, there's a little hospital here in Joburg some of them call it Caesar's Palace. But Park Lane Clinic performs a lot of cesarean section births. Yes? Says the Gemara that Caesar's mother struggled giving birth. She was losing her babies. So what happened? After a number of years, says the Gemara, this is in Tractate Avodah Zarah, L'sof kama shanim, after a number of years, malach aleim echad bechazaka, there was an individual who forcibly seized the power of Rome. Shemesa imai belidata, his mother died during his birth. Benifkas bitna, her womb was cut open, and he was found alive. The first recorded cesarean section birth in Jewish history, and not Jewish history, in history, at least what we know of. So that's why he was called Caesar, because, as the Talmud puts it, he was born by a cesarean section. The word Caesar means to cut. And so because he was born by a cesarean section, so therefore he is called Caesar. Because the Latin term Caesar means cut. Okay? And the Talmud uses this term, Yotze Dofen. He came through the wall, through the womb of his mother. He had a cesarean birth, C-section. That's what the Talmud says. Because he was born this way, that's why he was called Caesar. And many people are born that way. I don't know if that's the first recorded one, but that's the one the Talmud mentions. So you know that it's an ancient procedure of birth. So that's why he's called Caesar, because he was born in that way. Now, the father of all the Caesars is Julius Caesar. Talmud describes his mother died at the time. Now, legend has it that Julius himself was born this way. There's different, you could go into Wikipedia and get the history. I just wanted to share with you a little bit about what the Talmud says. But then, why were all subsequent emperors of Rome called by that name, right? Why is this the universal name for royalty, for Roman emperors? And not just emperors. You look at, like I said, the German Kaiser, Austria, the Russian czars. And the truth is, in many, many languages, the term Caesar was adapted. Caesar and Caesar, I don't know but I believe in African languages, in Asian languages, and whatever other dialects, they use similar terms for the leader, for the emperor, for the person who's boss, who's in charge. Why? So let me tell you a little story that perhaps can illustrate, can help us understand this. They tell a story. There was a poor Yidel named Moishele, and he trudged up and down the steep staircase in the buildings in his neighborhood. He knocked on the doors. He's always asking for charity. And at the end of a particularly tiring day, he sat on a park bench and he counts all the coins that people gave him that day. And his mind wandered off. He started to dream of better days. And he thinks, one day I'm going to be rich. One day I'm going to own great fortunes. I have tremendous influence on my whole community. And he's rubbing, he's thinking, he's fat, he's daydreaming, right? He's thinking, he's imagining what's going to be. He says, then I'm going to make a new law. All new houses which are built will have to be only 1 or 2 stories high. My life will be that much easier. I won't have to climb all those stairs in order to collect geld tzedakah. Poor Moishele. He just couldn't liberate himself from the concept of begging for money. And in his fantasy, his wildest dream is that he's going to be so rich that he won't have to climb all the stairs of all the buildings to collect his couple of rands that he's collecting from different people. He simply couldn't imagine a life that's free from begging. He still sees himself so rich, begging in buildings, but they have to be coming in for him as he gets older. The first definition of a leader is that he doesn't have to follow. A leader leads. He leads his people to expand their horizons and introduces them to new, previously uncharted terrains. He opens new pathways in their thinking process and achieves what others might think is impractical. He's not influenced by what everyone else, the peer pressure. And only then can one truly lead and significantly enhance the lives of their followers, their constituents. You know the famous words of General Montgomery? The difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little bit longer. Well, the best way to describe such a personality is Caesar. What does the Caesar do? Breaks through the door, creates an opening where nobody saw was possible. This woman can't give birth to a child, but the Caesar is the one who breaks through. The true leader is the one who's able to extract a child through the unconventional channels and pathways. Where others see a closed wall, a womb that can't give birth, the Caesar is the one who breaks through, who creates an opening through that closed womb, through that closed wall. So that's the idea of a Caesar, not a Moishele who's stuck in a slave mentality. That's what we're trying to achieve on Pesach. God took us out of Egypt 3,333 years ago. But it's up to you and me to break free from our personal Egypt, from our own slavery, our habits, our addictions, our constraints, our limitations, the things that prevent us from achieving, from succeeding, from reaching our goals. With all due respect to the revolutionaries of history, the Caesars of history, Mashiach is going to be the greatest one yet, transforming the very consciousness of the entire world. Mashiach will win the greatest battles of all time. Which battle is that? The one we discussed here in this shir. The battle over our instinctive selfishness, over greed, over egocentricity, the battle over our perceived material crudeness. That's Mashiach. Mashiach will help people discover the inherent spirituality and unity of the entire universe, of every creature in this world. And such a leader has to think to himself, has to think out of the box, has to think in the most radical ways. Such a leader will reveal a new reality which the rest of us see as perhaps impossible. But the idea of Mashiach is to realize, I'm possible. As we discussed many times in these shiurim, this is not about history. Bible is his story. You know, there's no Hebrew word for history. Yeah, in modern Hebrew, you say historia. But that's just using an English or Latin word that's borrowed. The word used in the Torah is zikaron. What is zikaron? Memory. What's the difference between history and memory? History is it's his story, her story, it's the past. Memory is taking it real, making it mine, me, memory. What's it got to do with me? What's its relevance? What does that have to do with us? Mashiach will help us discover the relevance to each of us. Mashiach will reveal that nothing is impossible. Rather, the word itself says, I am possible. Mashiach will be that ultimate Caesarean birth the world needs. The wall which separates us from each other. The wall which separates us from God. The wall which eclipses our vision of the true integrated reality of our universe. That will be opened. We'll see a dawn of a new era. Not apocalypse as the world sees it. The end of time. Maybe the end of time as we know it. But the dawn of a new era. A whole new era that's upon us. The epoch of Mashiach. That's Mashiach, bringing a world of kindness to the world. That reality is the reality that we're seeking. So that's the significance of Mashiach. Mashiach is that leader who will take us, who will break through the walls. That's Mashiach. So besides for the message that we see in the definition of Mashiach's title as Caesar, but this language is critical to understand. The fact that Mashiach's title is a Roman term. Why? Why not a Jewish, why not a Hebrew term? In the Torah, generally referred to as Melech HaMashiach, the King Mashiach. Why here does the Talmud use a Roman terminology? Caesar? Perhaps, as the Rebbe explained, if his name was limited just to Hebrew, just to Lashon HaKodesh, then it would indicate that the impact that he has is limited just to us, just to Jews, just to Judaism. But that's not Mashiach. Mashiach's name is in a universal foreign language, the language of the Romans in Latin. And certainly the time of the Talmud, the Romans were the emperor, the Roman Empire, right? The leaders of the world. So the term that the Talmud uses for Mashiach is in Latin to express Mashiach's global impact. That's why specifically in Latin, because Mashiach is going to break the barriers, those walls that separate between all of humanity. That was the Rebbe's chap. Story comes to mind of it was once in Israel. There was somewhat of a deluded fellow who climbed the top of Har HaZeitim, Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. And he blew a shofar, and people started looking, this guy, maybe he's Mashiach, who knows? Well, there was a great rabbi there, Reb Mendel Vitebsker. He was a famous rabbi. He was living in Tiberias, in Tveria. And when they told him about this Mashiach blew the shofar on the Mount of Olives, is Mashiach here? So he checks. He opens his window. He puts his head outside and he snuffs and he says, no, unfortunately, the Redeemer has not yet arrived. On the day Mashiach comes, the whole world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the water covers the sea. All flesh will perceive, will see, will experience Mashiach. And you might ask, why did he have to go to the window? Why did he have to open the window to smell the presence of Mashiach? If he was so holy, if he was so great, wouldn't he know where he was? One of the answers explained is that for this Reb Mendel, in his room where he was, he already felt Mashiach. For a tzaddik, for a righteous person of his caliber, he always felt Mashiach. He was always in that mode. He was always feeling it. So in order for him to see if Mashiach came to the world, he had to open the window. He had to go outside. He had to see, is Mashiach there for everyone else? Is Mashiach a global impact? If it's just for me, I already feel it. But the significance, the importance of Mashiach is not just for the individual, but for all. Is Mashiach felt in a tangible way? And when he didn't smell Mashiach outside, nah, Mashiach's not here yet. It's not universally. When Mashiach comes, we're going to see it on WhatsApp. We're going to see it on TV. We're going to see it here, there, and everywhere. Ladies and gents, just give me Sorry. So we can't just have that the holy tzaddikim feel Mashiach. Mashiach has to be something that's felt, experienced by all the world, not just Israel, not just the Jewish people, but all of humanity will be changed. It's a universal peace, a universal redemption. So now we understand why Mashiach, perhaps based on the Rebbe's explanation, why in the Talmud Mashiach is called a Caesar. Why then is King David called the half Caesar? What's the implication of that interesting name, that title? So to answer this question, we'll have to reinterpret the words of the Talmud and continue with the understanding that the title half Caesar, why it's relevant to David HaMelech, really, perhaps you could say, just using that Sikha, that talk of the Rebbe, it's another title for Mashiach, who's a descendant of King David. So when the Talmud refers to David HaMelech in this context, the intention is not the historical great King David of old, but rather it's another persona, another aspect, another element of Mashiach. So the title half Caesar, the Talmud is telling us, is as follows. Where many kings throughout history, many Caesars were very brazen, audacious, unabashed, right? This quality of theirs often came with cruelty, with destruction. They imposed difficult realities on people. They dispersed people at their whim. They caused so much bloodshed, violence, so much pain in the world. And we've seen many revolutionaries, many people who dreamt big and maybe achieved impossible, but at what price? For what purpose? The French Revolution killed 3 million. And as a result of the Russian Revolution, 50 million were killed. Most revolutions in history have been brutal, bloody, denying human rights. What's unique about Mashiach's leadership, as we're told, is it will be the greatest revolution in history, right? But it will not be imposed on humanity. Mashiach will reveal the incredible potential that each human being innately possesses within ourselves. Mashiach is not going to impose on humanity a new world order to suit his dreams, his ambitions. Mashiach is about bringing universal peace to the world. It's what we want. That's why it says, he knew who oimed achar kaslenu. About Mashiach, it describes he's hiding behind the wall, ready to come through, waiting for us. We need to want Mashiach. So Mashiach will not only be a Caesar, creating this unprecedented, unmatched, unparalleled revolution, unlike anything previously in history. Mashiach's revolution will be one that is fully integrated into the consciousness of people, one that will resonate within our own souls and hearts. He will not be a Caesar creating an opening in a closed wall, but also a half Caesar, creating openings that don't seem radical at all because they resonate so deeply. That's the aspect of King David. Yes, Mashiach is a great revolutionary, but one who works within the framework of the people, not destroying them, but enhancing us. That's the idea. So we have the Caesar, world revolution, but there's the half Caesar, the idea of Mashiach working with all of society. Let me read it to you in the words of Rambam. Let me pick up the words of Rambam here. We can understand this, that Mashiach is not about violence, but Mashiach is bringing a world of peace. It's a global impact. Here's what Rambam describes Mashiach in the Laws of Kings, chapter 11. He says, if a king will arise from the house of David, who diligently contemplates the Torah and observes its mitzvahs, as described by the written law and the oral law, as King David, his ancestor, that is how you know this is an individual who is Mashiach bringing redemption to the world. Finally, when he builds the third temple and gathers the dispersed of Israel, then you know he's Mashiach. So he's bringing improvement to the world, motivating the nations to serve God. Those are the words Rambam describes. And listen to this. He says, in those days when Mashiach comes, there will be an increase of knowledge, of wisdom, of truth. It will be abundant, as the verse states, that the earth will be full of the knowledge of God, as we'll read on the last day of Pesach from the prophet Isaiah. One person will no longer teach hatred to another. There won't be hatred from nation to nation. There will be no more wars in the world. That's the description of Isaiah describing the future era of Mashiach. So these words, the words that Rambam takes from Isaiah to describe that future era, that's a whole different world. That's not a world of violence, of crime. That's not the Caesar. Rather, the idea coming from King David. So it's a dual dynamic, you could say. There's the Caesar, the half Caesar. And I think that's very relevant in understanding what the purpose of Mashiach is. So I want to come to a conclusion here that the concept of Mashiach in our lives, who's going to indeed change the face of the world, bring peace, redemption, all the wonderful things that Mashiach is about. Yes, he's called a Caesar because it's a whole new world order. But at the same time, he's called the half Caesar because Mashiach is about bringing to the world in a way that is something that the world wants and that the world needs. So hopefully we can understand the concept of both terminologies, and at the same time to understand why we read this on the last day of Pesach when we celebrate the splitting of the sea. What's it got to do with the splitting of the sea? You see, our ancestors passing through the Sea of Reeds, which we described earlier, wasn't geographically necessary, but it was a spiritual purpose. At the Sea of Reeds, we were shown the power of the human soul. The parting of the sea was the first cosmic Caesarean birth, where an unexpected opening was created. Just like the womb of the sea suddenly unnaturally opened up. So, in the very same way, Chassidus explains that the earth is comprised of oceans and continents, sea and dry land. In fact, I saw outside OR Tambo Airport a big billboard advertising UPS, and the sign read, "Water covers 73% of the world, we cover the rest." What's the difference between the waters and the dry land? The difference is that on the dry land, everything is open and visible. We could see it, right? The trees, the animals, the mountains, the people, everything. It's beautiful. It's accessible. We could see it. It's all around us. But, my friends, the sea is a big expanse of water. It's a mystery. You don't see what's in it. But if you study oceanography, or if you just go into the waters, as we all know, the waters aren't just water. Obviously, within the sea, it's teeming with life. When you look at it, you don't see anything, but we know that hidden beneath the surface, there is so much vitality, so much life. And the Talmud tells us that, in fact, kol sheyesh bayabash sheyesh bayam, everything that we have on the dry land is in the sea as well, right? That's why the seahorses and sea lions, there are so many comparisons. It's catfish, okay? So obviously, I don't know the scientific correlation of these species. Obviously, if you study it, go to an aquarium. I'm sure they could explain to you what the comparison is between a sea lion or seahorse or catfish and whatever it might be. The point is, the sea is the mystical twin of the land. That's what Chassidus tells us. The sea has mountains, it has canyons, it has rivers, it has weather systems. It's a whole ecosystem there. And living organisms of every single type that exist within the sea. Every form of imaginable vegetation. But everything is submerged within the watery depths. It's almost completely hidden from our eyes. By the same token, our physical world is mirrored by a hidden spiritual universe. So Chassidus applies this concept in a much broader sense as well, that the whole of reality, everything we see and experience, can be divided into two realms. There is the revealed and there is the hidden. The revealed includes all our material, physical realities that we see and experience all the time. And in fact, even the spiritual realities, right? But beyond what we see, there is a deeper reality, a deeper purpose for everything. So if the dry land represents that which we could see, and the sea represents that which we can't see, that which is hidden, the purpose of the splitting of the sea was to reveal that which is hidden. That's the idea of splitting the sea, why God split the sea. And if you study Chassidus, this is a deep, deep concept that explains this whole idea, which I can't get into right now into all the details of it. But the point is, just as it is with the spiritual, revealed, and hidden worlds, so it is with each of us, our realities. Our personality, we all have two layers. There's our sea, there's our dry land, okay? What we know of ourselves, our visible strengths, our tested talents, our known abilities, the elements of our character that each of us is aware of, and that's the dry land of our personality. But below the surface of our character, we know there is a vast sea of latent talents that we have not tapped into. Our inner strengths, our untapped abilities that we never knew we even had, they're waiting to be discovered. They're perhaps lying dormant, but waiting for us to uncover and discover them. That's our sea. That's our ocean. We ourselves are not even aware of what lies there. And at the very birth of our nation, we needed to learn of our mission. to split the sea, to bring out that hidden potential within ourselves. We need to prepare the world for that great Caesar who will reveal the infinite light which lies at the core of every single human, of every single creature. And this is why the last days of Pesach, we commemorate the splitting of the sea. It's correlated with the future redemption of Mashiach. Because the work that Mashiach will do really began at the moment when the waters split at Kriyas Yamsuf, when the ocean bed was revealed. At that epic moment in history, God sent the message to his people that they are charged with a mission that will climax thousands of years later with the coming of Mashiach. Mashiach will be the ultimate Caesar, opening barriers that we didn't know. Nothing's impossible. I am possible. But that already begun. We could already feel Mashiach like our Mendel Levita in Israel. We have to do our part to split our own sea. We have to experience Mashiach in our life already now, not just to anticipate redemption, but to precipitate, experience, reveal our own potentials. We have to look into our very consciousness and call on ourselves, on our reserves of our morality, of our strength of character. We have to look at our talents. We have to try to reveal them in the world. We have to create the impossible of what seems impossible in our lives. And so that's our task, my friends. That's what we have to do. We need that C-section of ourselves. And every one of us, we're all surrounded with people, with opportunities, with environments, with circumstances that are unique to each of us. We're indispensable to those situations. And it's our job to perform that same C-section on everything and everyone we encounter, to split the sea of our surroundings and reveal the seabed of potential that's deep within each of us. And the more that we do, the closer and closer we get to the ultimate, to that cosmic C-section with the coming of Mashiach. And that's what we are aiming for. We're aiming for that day when it will no longer be a fantasy, but it will become a reality. Let me conclude with a great story that I think could perhaps illustrate this. There are so many great stories, but here's one story that always comes to my mind this time of the year, especially since I got to celebrate Pesach one year in Russia 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. That this story comes to mind. There were two young Jewish students in Ukraine, Sasha and Misha, and they both were asked in 1989, when communism was finally coming to its end, that they should lead the Seder in their community in Ukraine. My cousin is a rabbi there in Ukraine, city of Kharkiv, and he told me the story. He says these two students, Russians, they went to a crash course, a seminar for 2 weeks, where they were told basically how to prepare for Pesach. And these guys, they never got to experience Pesach before under communism. They had very limited knowledge. But one thing they did have was enthusiasm, passion, excitement. They were excited to conduct their Seder. Misha had been to a Seder the previous year, okay? He was raised knowing that he was a Jew, but it didn't mean much to him because in Russia, you really couldn't practice your Judaism. Besides for a stamp in his passport that was part of the Russian communistic way that everything, your religion was identified in your passport, you were a cursed Jew. But other than that, he had no clue what it meant to be a Jew. It was nothing that made him different from any of his neighbors. His friend Sasha, on the other hand, was never even at a Seder. In fact, he was only told that he was a Jew when he was 19 years old. His parents were hesitant about identifying publicly as Jews because they were still skeptical that the post-Soviet openness, which then was basically in its infancy, who knows what's going to be. So they they basically just let him know he was Jewish at this stage in his life. And this is 4 days before Pesach. And they were asked to conduct a Seder in their community. There were about 700 Jews there. And they managed to get about 150 or so reservations of Jews who were willing, who wanted to come to their Seder. Some people said that's overly optimistic. You'll never get so many people to come. People are scared, people don't know. But they weren't deterred. And they came up with some money. They were able to rent a hall. They were able to buy whatever supplies, and Chabad helped out with 150 Haggadahs in Hebrew and Russian. And the first order of business was they needed to rent a space. They had the money, but now they need to rent a space. Where are they going to host? Where are they going to conduct the Seder? In the center of their town, there was a large building that was a local art school. It had a basement hall that was perfect for the Seder. It had tables, it had chairs, it had a little kitchen. And one of the school staff explained to them that this building actually was the local Communist Party headquarters, the KGB headquarters, just 4 years earlier. And that's why it was the perfect venue. It was so well fitted out. When the Soviet Union disbanded, so the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, they outlawed the Communist Party, and so the building became an art school. Sasha and Misha had their work cut out for them. They had to prepare, they had to get food, they had to hang posters up. They had to let the Jews of their town know there's going to be a Pesach Seder for the first time in like 70 years or so. And they got some kids together, they taught them Pesach songs, Dayenu, Manishtana. They decorated the whole whatever way possible. And now the Seder night arrived. The posters, the signs said the Seder will start at 7. But let me tell you something. I learned this also when I was in Russia. That you advertise a Seder for 7 p.m. and people are there by 4 p.m. The Russian babushkas, they're there. And Sasha Misha said the place was packed by 4 or 5 p.m. They already were outnumbered by the number of seats. And they said that by 7 o'clock, they already had a few hundred people and they didn't have anywhere to put them. Standing room only, squeezed into this hall. They didn't know what to do. There were people left outside the building. The fire regulations, if they ever existed there, probably, who knows what they would have said. And Sasha and Misha are now about to begin their Seder. The place is packed. Hundreds of people inside, outside, coming to experience their first Pesach in decades. There's no food for everyone, and they're all here. The place is just jam-packed. And so Sasha and Misha begin to try to explain to everyone what the purpose of a Seder is, and they start singing some songs, and people sing along. They're passing around some wine, the little bit you have to now take one that's prepared for 150 people and serve it with hundreds of people. The kids sing their songs, and they are having their Seder. And Sasha begins to explain what he learned in those 2 weeks of Pesach. And like a rush, the whole thing. And now he's up to the cup of Eliyahu HaNavi. And they're singing the song, Eliyahu HaNavi, Eliyahu HaTishbi, and explains to all these hundreds of people how Eliyahu HaNavi will be the harbinger of redemption of Mashiach to the world. And he spoke of all our troubles in Jewish history. And he tells everyone, just think about all our trouble, all our pain, all our persecution. And Eliyahu HaNavi is going to be the harbinger of redemption. That we're coming towards redemption. The world is going to be redeemed. And as he's saying this, Sasha relates that an old man stood up and pointed his finger at him and began to tell him, you believe in this Elijah? You believe in this Mashiach? What are you, crazy? The man had all these medals on him of, I guess, whatever awards they were. And he says to this young Sasha, This war hero is telling him, what are you, crazy? How could you believe in this? It was nice to celebrate our history, the ancient stories, but to tell us about this future, that's crazy. Everything till now was wonderful memories. I remembered the songs of my childhood. I remembered the good old days, my Zayda, my grandfather, my grandmother. It was wonderful to go back to the Seder's of my childhood. My grandfather would lead it in Hebrew and Yiddish. I remember all that from 80 years ago. Talking about our ancient history, our slavery, freedom, the questions, the answers, all that. But Mashiach, that's a Mishigas. How could you prove any of that will happen? It's a bunch of nonsense. It's made up. It's fantasy. Stick to tradition. Stick to our history. Leave the fantasy, the make-believe out of it. A lot of people in the room. Old man has a point, right? Well, Sasha could either have been very embarrassed at this moment, but instead, he got up, saw it as a test, an opportunity. On the one hand, here he has an old man, a war hero, who's putting him to the challenge. And what does he know, Sasha? He just started learning about being Jewish. But this was Sasha's answer. Turned to the old man and said, you're right. This business about the Mashiach, about the Messianic era of redemption, the future, it can't be empirically proven. It hasn't yet happened, right? But I want to ask you a question, Sasha says to this old man. Another fantasy, another leap of faith, that perhaps for you and me, just a few short years ago, would be so far-fetched. He said, imagine that you and I were walking down this street together 5 years ago, and we would have passed this building that we're in right now. This building, it's the most prominent building in town, KGB headquarters. Right on the facade of the building was that large stone circle with a hammer and sickle at the center. We would have stopped, looked, admired the building. And then I would have said to you, I know this will be hard to believe, but in 5 years from now, in the basement of this building of the KGB headquarters, our community is going to have a Pesach Seder. And we're going to advertise it everywhere. In the newspaper, on the radio, there are going to be posters all over the town. And hundreds of Jews are going to come out for it. And 2 young Jews, me and my friend Misha, are going to lead the Seder. And Jewish children are going to sing the songs, Dayenu Manishtana, all the beautiful songs. And families are going to learn together and experience Jewish tradition. Not secretly and rushed, but proudly in the public space, in this very building. Not just any building, in the KGB headquarters. Everybody's watching. And as he says this, he turns to the old man and says, now I ask you, that scenario, is that a fantasy? 5 years ago, perhaps, but today, it's reality. And with that, everyone burst into applaud. Everybody started to clap. And everyone began singing, Am Yisrael Chai, which was like the anthem of Soviet Jewry. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. That's how they saw the redemption. Not as a fantasy, but as their own reality. That, my friends, although there's other stories that could depict this as well, we'll conclude today's shiur. Hope you all enjoyed. Please God, hopefully tomorrow we'll have one more shiur before Pesach. And then we'll see about next week, Kol Hamayim maybe as well. Till then, Zach Gesund, everyone. Thanks for joining us and looking forward to much more.
Hey, Rabbi,
Yes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
is there any way of selling a chometz?
Yes, of course. Let me post it on I thought I sent that a WhatsApp. I'm going to send that a WhatsApp again. So you'll know where to sell it on the Chabad South Africa website. If you go to chabadsoutafrica.org, you will see on the homepage, we have a chametz sale, a place to sell your chametz. I'm going to post it now on the Chabad Seniors WhatsApp group. Okay.
Thank you.
So just go to the Chabad South Africa webpage and you'll see it all there. Okay. Just sent it. All right. Did you get it? Any questions before we go? Okay, till then, all the best. See you soon, please, God.
Danke
Yeshua
sehr.
for your shield, Shira.
Pardon?
Yeshua, Rabbi.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you all for joining. Good to
Thank
see
you,
you all,
Rabbi.
and see you tomorrow. Please, God, all the best.
Thank you. Danke sehr.